The sound of Chris Malone's ribs cracking echoed through the Sacramento Memorial Arena like gunshots. 2,000 pounds of pure rage named Rampage had just planted both hind hooves directly into the veteran bull rider's chest, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire arena fell silent. The crowd of 8,000 spectators who had been cheering wildly just seconds before now sat in stunned disbelief as they watched one of the sport's most respected competitors crumple to the dirt like a discarded rag doll. Chris lay motionless in the center of the arena, his signature black cowboy hat 20 feet away, his body positioned at an unnatural angle that made seasoned rodeo professionals in the crowd immediately recognize the severity of what they had just witnessed. The 42-year-old from Amarillo, Texas, who had conquered bulls across 3 different decades, was not moving at all. "Get the medical team in there now," shouted Mike Hendricks, the arena announcer whose usually booming voice now carried a desperate urgency that cut through the deafening silence. The bullfighters, those courageous men whose job it was to distract angry bulls and protect fallen riders, were already in motion, working frantically to guide the still agitated Rampage away from Chris's prone form. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the on-site emergency physician, vaulted over the arena barrier with a speed that belied her 53 years of age. She had been attending professional bull riders' events for over a decade, had seen broken bones, concussions, internal bleeding, and every conceivable injury that could result from the violent collision between human determination and animal power. But as she knelt beside Chris Malone and pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse that wasn't there, she knew this was different. This was the nightmare scenario that every rodeo medical professional hoped they would never encounter. "No pulse, no breathing," she called out to her medical team, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "We need the defibrillator now." In the stands, Sarah Malone felt her world collapse. She had been married to Chris for 18 years, had watched him compete in hundreds of events, had held her breath through countless close calls and celebrated countless victories. She knew the risks. Every bull rider's wife understood that their husband's passion came with the very real possibility of serious injury, or worse. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are 2 entirely different realities. "Chris, no, please no," she whispered, her hands pressed against the cold metal railing of the family section, her knuckles white with tension. Their 16-year-old daughter Emma sat beside her, tears streaming down her face as she watched the medical team work desperately on her father in the arena below. 14-year-old Jake Jr. stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing, his mind rejecting the possibility that his invincible father could be lying so still, so lifeless. The defibrillator's sharp electronic whine cut through the arena's oppressive silence as Dr. Walsh charged the device. "Clear," she shouted, and Chris's body jerked violently as electricity coursed through his chest. The heart monitor remained flat. Again, the second shock produced the same terrifying result, a flatline that seemed to mock their efforts. Tom Bradley, Chris's traveling partner and closest friend for the past 8 years, had managed to make his way down to the arena floor despite security attempts to keep spectators back. Tom had been a bull rider himself until a career-ending neck injury 5 years earlier, and he had seen enough wrecks to know when someone was seriously hurt. But this was beyond serious. This was his best friend, the man who had been best man at his wedding, the godfather to his twin daughters, lying in the dirt without a heartbeat. "Come on, Chris, don't you dare leave us," Tom muttered under his breath, his own hands shaking as he watched the medical team continue their resuscitation efforts. "Sarah needs you, the kids need you. We all need you." The arena's public address system crackled to life as Mike Hendricks attempted to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're asking for your patience and your prayers as our medical team tends to Chris Malone. Please remain in your seats and keep Chris and his family in your thoughts." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, betraying the emotion he was trying to suppress. Dr. Walsh administered the 3rd electrical shock, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the monitor showed irregular activity. "I've got something," she announced, her fingers once again finding Chris's neck. "Weak, but it's there. Get him loaded, we need to move now." The emergency medical technicians, who had been standing by with a backboard and stretcher, moved with practiced efficiency. They had performed this routine countless times, but never with stakes this high, never with an arena full of people holding their collective breath, never with a man whose name was synonymous with courage and determination in their sport. As they lifted Chris onto the stretcher, his eyes fluttered open for just a moment. His gaze found Tom's face in the crowd of medical personnel, and his lips moved almost imperceptibly. Tom leaned closer, straining to hear whatever his friend was trying to say. "Tell Sarah," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible above the commotion. "Tell her I love her. Tell the kids." "You tell them yourself," Tom replied firmly, gripping Chris's hand. "You're going to be fine. You're Chris Malone, remember? You don't quit, you never quit." But as they wheeled him toward the waiting ambulance, Chris's eyes closed again, and the brief spark of consciousness that had given everyone hope faded back into an ominous stillness. The ride that had started like so many others, with Chris Malone's name being called over the arena's sound system, with him settling onto the back of a bull named Rampage, with 8 seconds of anticipated glory stretching out before him, had ended in a way that no one could have imagined. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through every corner of the arena. As the vehicle pulled away, its sirens wailing into the California night, 8,000 people sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. They had come to see athletic competition, to witness the age-old battle between human will and animal power. Instead, they had seen something far more profound and terrifying. They had seen mortality itself played out in the starkest possible terms. Sarah Malone, still seated in the family section with her children, watched the ambulance disappear into the distance. 18 years of marriage had taught her to expect the unexpected in this sport, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Nothing could have prepared her for the possibility that the last words she had spoken to her husband, a casual "be careful out there," as he left their hotel room that evening, might actually be their final conversation. In the arena below, maintenance crews were already beginning to rake the dirt, erasing the physical evidence of what had occurred. But for everyone who had witnessed Chris Malone's collision with Rampage, for everyone who had seen one of rodeo's most respected competitors lying motionless in the dirt, the memory would prove impossible to erase. The image of a man who had spent his entire adult life conquering fear being conquered by circumstance would haunt them all. The Sacramento Invitational continued that night, as sporting events always do, with other riders climbing onto other bulls, with other stories of triumph and defeat playing out in the arena. But the energy had changed, the atmosphere forever altered by those 8 seconds that had transformed a routine bull ride into something far more significant. 8 seconds that had reminded everyone present that beneath all the excitement and competition and athletic spectacle, bull riding remained what it had always been, a dangerous dance with forces beyond human control. As the night wore on, as other competitors completed their rides and the crowd slowly began to return to normal, one question hung over everything like a shadow. Would Chris Malone ever ride again? If this story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. The fluorescent lights of Sacramento Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit cast an unforgiving glare over everything, turning even the healthiest visitors pale and ghostly. Sarah Malone had been staring at those lights for 6 hours now, ever since the ambulance had delivered her husband to the emergency room with a barely detectable pulse and internal injuries that the attending physician had described as extensive and life-threatening. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the hospital's chief of cardiothoracic surgery, emerged from the intensive care unit with the kind of expression that medical professionals develop after years of delivering news that families never want to hear. At 45, Dr. Martinez had performed thousands of surgeries, had saved countless lives, had also lost patients despite her best efforts. She recognized the look in Sarah Malone's eyes, the desperate hope mixed with paralyzing fear that defined the families of critically injured patients. "Mrs. Malone," Dr. Martinez began, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that populated the hospital's family waiting area. "Your husband is stable, but I want to be completely honest with you about his condition." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of her chair. Emma and Jake Jr. sat on either side of her, their young faces bearing expressions far too mature for their ages. In the space of a few hours, they had been forced to confront the reality that their father, the man who had always seemed invincible, who had conquered every challenge that life had thrown at him, was suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable. "The impact from the bull caused severe trauma to Chris's chest," Dr. Martinez continued. "He suffered multiple rib fractures, a collapsed lung, and most seriously what we call cardiac contusion, basically bruising to the heart muscle itself. His heart actually stopped beating at the scene, and while we were able to restart it, the organ has sustained significant damage." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Cardiac contusion. Heart stopped beating. Significant damage. These were phrases that belonged in medical textbooks, not in conversations about her husband, the man who had been mowing their lawn just last week, who had coached Jake Jr.'s Little League team the previous season, who had danced with her in their kitchen just 3 nights ago while waiting for dinner to finish cooking. What does that mean exactly? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At 16, she was old enough to understand the seriousness of medical terminology, but still young enough to hope that adult knowledge might somehow change the reality of the situation. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly, her manner gentle but direct. It means your father's heart isn't pumping as efficiently as it should be. The trauma has affected the muscle's ability to contract properly, which puts stress on his entire cardiovascular system. We're monitoring him very closely, and we have him on medications to help support his heart function. But what? Sarah interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. But we don't yet know the full extent of the damage. Hearts can be remarkably resilient, and sometimes they heal better than we expect. Other times, the damage is permanent. We won't know which category your husband falls into for several days, possibly weeks. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of hospital activity. The soft ping of monitors, the hushed conversations of medical staff, the subtle hum of machinery that kept critically ill patients alive. Sarah found herself focusing on these sounds, using them as anchors to prevent her mind from spiraling into the terrifying possibilities that Dr. Martinez had just outlined. Tom Bradley had been sitting quietly in the corner of the waiting room, having driven straight to the hospital after the ambulance had left the arena. As Chris's closest friend and traveling companion, he felt a responsibility to be there for Sarah and the kids, even though he was struggling to process his own emotions about what had happened. The image of Chris lying motionless in the arena dirt kept playing in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Can we see him?" Jake Jr. asked, speaking for the first time since they had arrived at the hospital. At 14, he idolized his father in the way that only teenage boys could, and the thought of Chris being hurt, truly hurt, was something his mind could barely comprehend. "He's unconscious right now," Dr. Martinez replied. "We've had to sedate him to help his body focus on healing. But yes, you can see him one at a time for a few minutes each." Sarah was the first to enter the intensive care unit, and the sight of her husband nearly brought her to her knees. Chris lay surrounded by a forest of medical equipment, monitors beeping rhythmically for lines feeding medications into his system, a ventilator helping him breathe. His face, usually tanned and weathered from years of outdoor work and competition, looked pale and drawn against the white hospital pillow. She approached his bed slowly, almost afraid that any sudden movement might disturb the delicate balance of machines keeping him alive. When she finally reached his side and took his hand in hers, she was shocked by how cold it felt. Chris had always been a man who ran warm, whose hands were constantly active, constantly working. Now those same hands lay still and lifeless. "I don't know if you can hear me," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "But the kids are here, and they're scared. Tom's here too. Everyone from the circuit has been calling, asking about you. You've got people praying for you all across the country." There was no response, no flicker of recognition, no sign that Chris was aware of her presence. The man who had filled every room he entered with energy and personality now lay as still as stone. When Emma entered the room 15 minutes later, she barely recognized the figure in the hospital bed as her father. The Chris Malone she knew was always in motion, fixing something around the house, practicing rope techniques in the backyard, teaching her and Jake Jr. to ride horses at their uncle's ranch outside of town. This version of her father, connected to machines and surrounded by the sterile efficiency of medical intervention, seemed like a stranger. "Dad," she said softly, approaching the bed with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. "It's Emma. Mom says you might be able to hear us, even though you're sleeping." She sat in the chair beside his bed, studying his face for any sign of the man who had taught her to drive stick shift, who had stayed up late helping her with algebra homework, who had threatened her first boyfriend with various forms of creative violence delivered with a smile that somehow made the threats seem both humorous and completely sincere. "You have to get better," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Jake Jr. has a baseball game next week, and you promised you'd be there. And I'm supposed to graduate next month, and you're supposed to walk me across the stage because I'm valedictorian, remember? You can't miss that. You've never missed anything important in my life." When Jake Jr.'s turn came, he stood at the foot of his father's bed for several minutes without saying anything. At 14, he was caught in that awkward space between childhood and adulthood, old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation, but not yet equipped with the emotional vocabulary to process it fully. "I keep thinking about last weekend," he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "When you were teaching me to tie that new knot, the one for securing loads in the truck. I kept messing it up, getting frustrated, and you just kept showing me over and over until I got it right." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "That's what you do, Dad. You never give up on anything, you never quit. So you can't quit now, okay? You have to keep fighting." Tom Bradley was the last to visit, and his conversation with Chris was different from the family's emotional appeals. Tom had known Chris for over a decade, had shared hotel rooms and long drives, and the particular bond that develops between men who regularly risk their lives for sport. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the drive that had led Chris back into the arena at 42, the need to prove that age and accumulated injuries couldn't diminish the fire that had burned inside him since he was a teenager. "You know, everyone's calling this a freak accident," Tom said, settling into the visitor's chair. "But you and I both know there's no such thing as accidents in our sport. Every time we climb on, we know the risks. The question is whether we're willing to accept those risks for what we get in return." He was quiet for a moment, studying his friend's still form. "The thing is, Chris, I'm not sure what we're supposed to get in return for this. Sarah and the kids need you. Hell, I need you. You're the closest thing to a brother I've ever had." As visiting hours ended, and the family was asked to return to the waiting room, Dr. Martinez approached them with an update. "His vital signs are stable, which is encouraging. We're going to continue monitoring him closely through the night, and we should know more about his neurological status when the sedation wears off tomorrow." "Neurological status?" Sarah asked, a new wave of fear washing over her. "Mrs. Malone, your husband was without a pulse for several minutes at the arena. While the paramedics did an excellent job with CPR, any interruption in blood flow to the brain raises concerns about potential cognitive effects. We won't know the extent of any issues until he regains consciousness." The possibility that Chris might have suffered brain damage was a complication that Sarah hadn't even considered. The man she had married was not just physically strong but intellectually sharp, quick-witted, capable of complex problem-solving under pressure. The thought that those qualities might have been compromised was almost more terrifying than the physical injuries. As the family settled in for what they knew would be a long night, word of Chris's condition began to spread throughout the tight-knit rodeo community. Professional bull riders issued a statement asking for prayers and respect for the family's privacy. Social media exploded with messages of support from competitors, fans, and industry professionals who had been touched by Chris's career and character. In arenas across the country, riders dedicated their performances to Chris Malone. In small towns throughout Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and beyond, people who had never met Chris personally, but who understood what he represented: courage, determination, the refusal to surrender to fear, gathered in churches and community centers to pray for his recovery. But in room 314 of Sacramento Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit, surrounded by the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of life support equipment, Chris Malone continued his most important fight. Not against a 2,000-pound bull this time, but against injuries that threatened not just his career, but his life itself. 5 days had passed since the accident, and Chris Malone's eyes finally fluttered open in the pre-dawn darkness of his hospital room. For several disorienting moments, he couldn't remember where he was or why his body felt like it had been hit by a freight train. The last clear memory he had was settling onto Rampage's back, adjusting his grip on the bull rope, and nodding to signal the gate crew. Everything after that was a blank slate that filled him with a panic more intense than any he had ever experienced in the arena. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the ventilator tube that had been removed just the day before. The effort of speaking sent sharp pains through his chest, and he instinctively tried to sit up, which only made the pain worse. "I'm here, I'm right here," Sarah replied, awakening instantly from her uncomfortable sleep in the recliner beside his bed. She had barely left his side since the accident, surviving on hospital cafeteria coffee and the sandwiches that well-meaning friends from the rodeo community had been delivering regularly. "Don't try to move too much, baby. You've been hurt pretty badly." Chris tried to piece together what had happened based on his surroundings. The hospital room, the 4 lines, the monitors displaying numbers he didn't understand. all of it pointed to something serious, something beyond the routine injuries that were part of his profession. "How long have I been here?" 5 days, Sarah answered, taking his hand carefully, mindful of the 4-line. "You had an accident at Sacramento. Rampage caught you in the chest with his back hooves after you came off." Your heart stopped, Chris. For almost 4 minutes, your heart wasn't beating. The words hit him like a physical blow. Chris had suffered his share of injuries over the years, broken ribs, separated shoulders, concussions that left him dizzy for weeks. But he had never faced anything that threatened his life so directly. The realization that he had essentially died and been brought back was overwhelming, terrifying in a way that no bull had ever been. "The kids?" he asked, his mind immediately jumping to Emma and Jake Jr. "They're okay. Scared, but okay. They've been here every day after school." Emma actually skipped a few classes, which isn't like her. Sarah's attempt at lightness couldn't mask the exhaustion and worry that lined her face. "They'll be here later this afternoon." Dr. Martinez arrived for morning rounds shortly after Chris regained consciousness, and her examination revealed both encouraging and concerning developments. The good news was that his cognitive function appeared intact. He could remember details from before the accident, could perform simple mental tasks, could carry on coherent conversations. The concerning news was that his heart was still struggling to function normally. "Mr. Malone, I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you," Dr. Martinez said, settling into the chair that had become as familiar to the Malone family as their own furniture at home. "Your heart sustained significant damage in the accident. We're managing it with medications right now, but your cardiac output, essentially how much blood your heart can pump, is functioning at about 60% of normal capacity." Chris absorbed this information with the same stoic expression he had always worn when facing challenging bulls. "What does that mean for my recovery?" "It means your recovery is going to be long and difficult. You'll need extensive cardiac rehabilitation, probably months of supervised exercise and therapy. You'll be on medications for the foreseeable future. And Chris, I have to be direct with you. Your bull riding days are over. Your heart simply cannot withstand that kind of physical stress anymore." The finality of those words, "Your bull riding days are over," seemed to echo in the small hospital room. Chris had always known that his career would end eventually, but he had imagined it would be his decision, made on his own terms, perhaps after one final championship season. He had never considered that the choice might be taken away from him so abruptly, so completely. "How over?" he asked quietly. "Are we talking about never riding again, or never competing professionally?" Dr. Martinez's expression softened slightly, recognizing the difficulty of what she was telling a man who had defined himself through physical courage for over 2 decades. "Chris, I wouldn't recommend you getting on a horse for a trail ride, much less a bull. The risk of another cardiac event, especially under stress, is simply too high." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma and Jake Jr., who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway since visiting hours began. Seeing their father awake and alert for the first time in 5 days brought tears to both of their eyes, but also raised questions they weren't sure how to ask. "Dad, are you really okay?" Emma asked, studying his face for signs of the man she remembered. She had spent the past 5 days researching cardiac injuries online, learning more about heart damage and brain oxygen deprivation than any 16-year-old should have to know. "I'm getting there, sweetheart," Chris replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The physical pain was manageable, but the psychological impact of learning that his career was over was something he hadn't begun to process. "It's going to take some time, but I'm going to be fine." Jake Jr. hung back slightly, unsure how to interact with this version of his father, who looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital bed and medical equipment. "When are you coming home?" he asked. "Soon," Chris said, though he honestly had no idea what soon meant in this context. "Dr. Martinez says I need to get stronger first, but soon." Over the following days, as Chris's physical condition slowly improved, the full scope of his new reality began to set in. Physical therapy sessions left him exhausted after just a few minutes of gentle exercise. Tasks that had once been effortless, walking to the bathroom, climbing a flight of stairs, now required careful planning and frequent rest breaks. The medications he was prescribed came with side effects that affected his energy levels, his concentration, his entire sense of well-being. But perhaps the most difficult adjustment was psychological. For over 20 years, Chris Malone had been defined by his relationship with danger, by his ability to conquer fear and perform under extreme pressure. He was the man who could climb onto the back of a 2,000-pound animal and somehow find a way to stay there for 8 seconds, no matter how violent the ride became. Now he was a man who got winded walking from his hospital bed to the window. "I keep thinking about what comes next," he confided to Tom Bradley during one of his friend's daily visits. "I mean, I'm 42 years old, and bull riding is literally the only thing I've ever done professionally. I started competing when I was 17, never went to college, never developed any other skills. What am I supposed to do now?" Tom, who had faced his own career-ending injury 5 years earlier, understood the identity crisis that Chris was experiencing. "You know, when I first got hurt, I thought my life was over. I couldn't imagine being anything other than a bull rider. But then I started working with that youth program back in Houston, teaching kids the basics, helping them learn to ride safely. It's different from competing, but it's still meaningful. It's still connected to what we love about this sport." The suggestion planted a seed in Chris's mind, though he wasn't ready to seriously consider alternative futures yet. The grief process for the loss of his career was still too raw, too immediate. He needed time to mourn the life he had planned before he could begin building a new one. Sarah watched her husband struggle with these emotions while dealing with her own complex feelings about the accident. Part of her was relieved. She would never again have to sit in arena stands holding her breath while Chris risked his life for 8 seconds of glory. But she also recognized that the man she had married was partially defined by that risk-taking, by his willingness to face down fear in pursuit of excellence. She wondered if the Chris Malone who emerged from this experience would still be the same man she had fallen in love with 18 years earlier. "I've been thinking," she said one evening as they sat together in his hospital room, "about that piece of land outside Austin that we looked at last year. Remember? The one with the small ranch house and enough pasture for a few horses." Chris nodded, remembering the property they had discussed as a potential retirement purchase, something for someday, when his riding career was behind him. "Maybe someday is now," Sarah continued carefully. "Maybe this is the universe telling us it's time to start that next chapter we've been talking about." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. A ranch would provide the connection to rural life and animals that had always been important to Chris, but it would also represent a complete departure from the structured competition and travel that had defined his adult existence. It would mean accepting that his identity would have to change, that he would have to find new ways to define success and fulfillment. As his hospital stay extended into a second week, Chris began to attract visits from unexpected sources. Buck Williams, a legendary bull rider from the 1980s who had faced his own career-ending injury, stopped by to share his experience of transitioning from competition to other pursuits. Several younger riders came to pay their respects, acknowledging Chris as a mentor and role model who had influenced their own approaches to the sport. Perhaps most meaningfully, Danny Peterson, the rider whose career had been effectively ended by his encounter with Rampage 3 years earlier, made the drive from Denver to Sacramento to visit Chris in person. "I heard about what happened," Danny said, settling into the now familiar visitor's chair. "And I wanted to tell you something that nobody told me when I got hurt. What you're feeling right now, the anger, the sadness, the sense that you've lost a part of yourself, all of that is normal. You're going to go through a grieving process, and that's okay." Danny's visit was particularly impactful because he represented proof that life could continue, could even be meaningful, after a career-ending rodeo injury. He had used his settlement money from the accident to start a small construction company, had married his longtime girlfriend, had become a father. His life looked different than he had planned, but it was undeniably a good life. "The thing I learned," Danny continued, "is that the qualities that made us good bull riders, determination, the ability to perform under pressure, willingness to take calculated risks, those don't just disappear because we can't compete anymore. We just have to find new ways to use them." By the time Chris was finally discharged from Sacramento Memorial Hospital after 2 weeks of treatment, he had begun to accept the reality of his situation. His career as a professional bull rider was over, ended not by his choice, but by circumstance beyond his control. However, his life was far from over. He had a wife who loved him, children who needed him, friends who respected him, and hopefully years ahead to discover what the next chapter would hold. The drive back to Texas was subdued, with Chris sleeping for much of the journey as Sarah handled the driving duties. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their modest ranch house outside Amarillo, Chris felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at being home, sadness at the circumstances that had brought him there, uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. But as Emma and Jake Jr. ran out to greet them, as neighbors and friends began stopping by to check on his recovery, as the familiar sounds and smells of rural Texas surrounded him. Chris began to understand that while one chapter of his life had ended abruptly and traumatically, another was just beginning. The challenge now would be writing that new chapter in a way that honored both his past and his future. 6 months after the accident, Chris Malone stood at the edge of a dusty arena in Kerrville, Texas, watching a nervous 16-year-old named Marcus Rivera settle onto the back of a practice bull. The boy's form was decent but not great. His grip on the bull rope was too tight, his free arm positioned incorrectly, his center of gravity slightly off balance. A year ago, Chris would have been preparing for his own ride at this time of day. Now he was learning to find satisfaction in passing along the knowledge he had accumulated over 2 decades of professional competition. "Remember what we talked about, Marcus," Chris called out, his voice carrying the authority of experience, but also the patience of a man who had learned that teaching required different skills than competing. "Let the bull do the work. You're not trying to control him, you're trying to move with him." The transformation from competitor to instructor had not been easy. During the first month at home in Amarillo, Chris had struggled with depression and a sense of purposelessness that worried Sarah and the kids. The daily routine of cardiac rehabilitation, medications, and restricted activity felt like a prison sentence for someone who had lived his entire adult life in constant motion. The ranch house that had once felt like a peaceful retreat now seemed confining, and Chris found himself sleeping until noon and spending hours sitting on the front porch staring at the horizon. It was Emma who had finally confronted him about his withdrawal from life. "Dad, I get that you're sad about not being able to ride anymore," she had said one afternoon, settling onto the porch swing beside him. "But you're acting like your whole life is over, and that's not fair to any of us. We need you to be present, not just physically here but actually engaged with what's happening in our family." Her words had stung because they were accurate. Chris had been so focused on mourning what he had lost that he had stopped paying attention to what he still had. Sarah was dealing with her own adjustment to having him home full-time, managing both relief at his safety and concern about his emotional state. Jake Jr. was struggling with his freshman year of high school, needing guidance that Chris hadn't been providing. Emma was preparing for college applications, a process that would benefit from parental involvement and support. The turning point had come when Tom Bradley called with an opportunity. The youth rodeo program in Houston that Tom had mentioned during Chris's hospital stay was looking for someone to help with their bull riding instruction. The program worked with kids from urban backgrounds who had little exposure to rodeo sports, providing training and mentorship that went beyond just technical skills. "It's not charity work," Tom had explained during their phone conversation. "These kids are serious about learning, and they need someone with real credentials to teach them. The pay isn't much, but it's something. And Chris, I think you'd be good at it. You always had a way of explaining things that made sense to younger riders." The first day Chris had driven to Houston to observe the program, he had been skeptical about his ability to contribute meaningfully. The kids were enthusiastic but raw, their understanding of bull riding technique limited to what they had seen on television or YouTube videos. Many of them came from challenging backgrounds, single-parent households, neighborhoods where opportunities were limited, families struggling with economic hardship. But as Chris watched them practice, he began to see something that reminded him of his younger self. These kids had the same hunger he remembered from his teenage years, the same willingness to risk injury in pursuit of something that mainstream society might not understand or value. They reminded him that bull riding, at its core, was about more than just 8 seconds of competition. It was about testing yourself against forces beyond your control and discovering what you were capable of when everything was on the line. Marcus Rivera was one of those kids. At 16, he was the same age Chris had been when he first started competing seriously. Marcus came from a single-parent household in East Houston, raised by his grandmother while his mother worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat financially. Bull riding represented both an escape from the challenges of his daily life and a potential path toward college scholarships and opportunities that might otherwise be unavailable. "Better," Chris called out as Marcus completed his practice ride, staying on the gentler training bull for the full 8 seconds. "Your timing on the dismount needs work, but your seat was much more solid that time." The instruction Chris provided went beyond just technical aspects of bull riding. He found himself talking to the young riders about goal setting, about the discipline required to excel at anything worthwhile, about the importance of education and having backup plans. His own experience of having his career end suddenly and unexpectedly provided powerful context for these conversations. "The thing about bull riding," he told the group during one of their regular training sessions, "is that it teaches you to perform under pressure, to stay focused when everything around you is chaotic, to get back up when you get knocked down. Those skills are valuable, whether you become a professional rider, or a doctor, or a teacher, or anything else." Working with the youth program had also reconnected Chris with his love for the sport itself, even if he could no longer participate as a competitor. He found himself studying videos of current riders with the same intensity he had once brought to analyzing his own performance, identifying techniques and strategies that he could pass along to his students. Sarah had noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. The depression that had characterized his first months at home began to lift as he found new purpose in teaching. He started getting up earlier, taking better care of his physical health, engaging more fully with family activities and conversations. "You know," she said one evening as they sat together on their back porch watching the sunset, "I think you might be a better instructor than you ever were a competitor. You have patience now that you didn't have when you were younger." The observation was accurate. The Chris Malone who had competed professionally had been driven by an urgency that sometimes made him impatient with slower learners or less naturally talented riders. The Chris Malone who was teaching now had the perspective that came from understanding how quickly careers could end, how important it was to savor the learning process rather than rushing toward results. Meanwhile, the family was adjusting to other changes as well. Emma had been accepted to Texas A&M University with a partial academic scholarship, her excellent grades and extracurricular activities opening doors that her parents' financial situation might not have allowed otherwise. She planned to study agricultural business, with the long-term goal of helping ranch families improve their operations and financial sustainability. Jake Jr. had found his own passion in high school baseball, discovering that he had inherited his father's competitive drive and ability to perform under pressure. Chris never missed a game, and his presence in the stands provided a steady source of encouragement and analysis. The boy was developing into a solid pitcher with the potential to earn his own college scholarship. "It's weird," Jake Jr. had commented recently, "but having you at every game actually makes me less nervous, not more. I know that whatever happens, you understand what it's like to compete, what it's like to deal with pressure." The ranch property outside Austin that Sarah had mentioned during Chris's hospital stay had become more than just a hypothetical future plan. They had made an offer on the land 6 months after the accident, using the insurance settlement from Chris's career-ending injury as a down payment. The property included 40 acres of pasture land, a modest ranch house that needed renovation, and enough space to potentially develop their own youth rodeo training facility. "I keep thinking about expanding the program," Chris told Sarah as they walked the property boundaries during one of their weekend visits. "Maybe creating a place where kids from the city can come for week-long intensives, learn not just bull riding but horsemanship, ranch work, outdoor skills that they never get exposure to otherwise." The vision was ambitious but not unrealistic. Chris's reputation in the rodeo community provided credibility that would be valuable for fundraising and recruiting participants. His experience with the Houston program had given him insight into what worked and what didn't in youth rodeo education. And the property itself was ideally situated, close enough to major cities to be accessible but rural enough to provide an authentic ranch experience. As the 1-year anniversary of the accident approached, Chris found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed. The career that had defined him for over 2 decades was behind him, ended not on his terms, but by circumstances beyond his control. The physical limitations imposed by his heart condition would be with him permanently, a daily reminder of his mortality and vulnerability. But the man who had emerged from that experience was different from the one who had climbed onto Rampage's back in Sacramento. He was more patient, more thoughtful, more attuned to the needs and perspectives of others. The competitive fire that had driven him as a rider had been channeled into new purposes: teaching, mentoring, building something that would outlast his own participation in the sport. "You know what I realized yesterday?" he said to Sarah as they drove back to Amarillo after another weekend of working on the ranch property. "I spent 25 years trying to prove that I could stay on bulls for 8 seconds. But everything I'm doing now, the teaching, the program development, the work with kids, all of that requires staying power that's measured in years, not seconds." The accident had forced Chris to confront fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. The answers he had found were different from the ones he might have expected a year earlier, but they were no less authentic or fulfilling. Marcus Rivera had become something of a star in the Houston youth program, his natural talent and dedicated practice earning recognition in regional competitions. More importantly, his grades had improved significantly since joining the program, and he was beginning to explore college opportunities that would allow him to continue riding while pursuing education. "Mr. Malone," Marcus said after a particularly successful training session, "I wanted to tell you something. Before I started working with you, I thought bull riding was just about being tough, about proving you weren't afraid. But you taught me that it's really about discipline and preparation and respecting the animal. That's changed how I think about everything else in my life too." Comments like Marcus's reminded Chris why his new career path felt so rewarding. He was influencing young people at a formative stage of their development, helping them develop not just riding skills, but life skills that would serve them regardless of what paths they ultimately chose. The ranch project was moving forward steadily, with construction scheduled to begin on additional facilities within the next 6 months. Chris had developed a business plan for what he was calling the Malone Youth Ranch Experience, a program that would combine bull riding instruction with broader lessons about agriculture, animal husbandry, and rural life skills. The goal isn't to create more professional bull riders, he explained to potential investors and community supporters. The goal is to use bull riding as a vehicle for teaching young people about courage, perseverance, respect for animals, and the value of hard work. If some of them go on to compete professionally, that's great. But if they just become better people, better students, better citizens, then we've succeeded. As Chris looked toward the future, he could see possibilities that hadn't existed during his competing years. The ranch program had the potential to impact hundreds of young people over the coming decades. His reputation and experience provided a platform for advocating for rider safety improvements and youth development initiatives within the broader rodeo community. The man who had once measured success in seconds and prize money was learning to think in terms of lives influenced and opportunities created. It was a different kind of legacy than he had originally planned, but it was no less meaningful. On quiet evenings at home, when the medications and physical limitations reminded him of what the accident had cost, Chris sometimes allowed himself to wonder what might have been different if Rampage's hooves had missed their mark. But those moments of speculation were brief, quickly replaced by appreciation for what was rather than regret for what wasn't. He had a wife who loved him, children who were thriving, students who respected him, and work that provided genuine purpose. His heart might be damaged, but it was still beating. His riding career might be over, but his life was far from finished. 8 seconds had ended one chapter of Chris Malone's story. But the chapters that followed were proving to be richer, more complex, and ultimately more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined while sitting atop a bull named Rampage on that fateful night in Sacramento. If this story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.